And we are joined now by Mya Frazier, investigative journalist based in Ohio, fellow at the Watchdog Writers Group at the University of Missouri School of Journalism, whose latest piece in Harper's is entitled The Eviction Experts. Mya, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for your interest.
So your piece starts off in 2021 at a meeting for the Columbus Apartment Association, this landlord lobbying group in Ohio. And this is in the immediate aftermath of the COVID eviction moratorium expiring. What did you see at this meeting, this kind of conference that you went to, which when I was reading your piece in Harper's, it gave me kind of chills down my spine about how corporatized and how automated, honestly, this process of evicting people from their homes is beginning to become.
Yeah, I had started spending some time at my local eviction court during the pandemic from some previous stories I'd been working on. And I started getting interested in this one law firm who filed the most evictions in court and was trying to understand sort of the power dynamics within my local eviction court. And someone mentioned, the main managing partner of this law firm that files the most evictions in Columbus mentioned he was, headed to promote their services at this conference. And so, I headed out there that day and was really kind of intrigued by what I found, because it was a lot of these booths that you would think at an apartment association, there were the normal booths for cleaning up, apartments that were messed up or landscaping and so on. But there was also just this very all these booths, tech booths. It was almost kind of like a bunch of startups and promoting a lot of services that would allow landlords to not even be directly involved in managing their properties. And so that was very intriguing, just the rise of prop tech, which is this industry that is just during that time frame was getting billions of dollars in investment.
Yeah, you have a sentence here that I thought summed it up quite nicely. Two converging trends, the automation of property management and Wall Street's consolidation of America's rental housing stock, had exacerbated the already uneven power dynamics of the landlord-tenant relationship. And that the symbolism of what you saw in that particular meeting or conference seems to represent that. If you could just speak to those two trends in particular and what you witnessed and what you wrote about, both the automation of property management, as you touched on there, and Wall Street's involvement as well.
Certainly. Sorry, now my iMessage is going. Certainly.
We don't hear it, don't worry.
The interesting thing that I saw was that I was watching what was going on in eviction court. I was watching the efficiencies that this local law firm had there and trying to understand how is that possible. And so in understanding the growth of property management, you saw how they were able to prepare all the documents, all the information that was necessary to start an eviction. So there is almost like a triggering mechanism that's possible now within property management, within these software systems, where there's just certain conditions they're able to put on the inflows of rent, the late fees, what would trigger an eviction, and just the ease with which they're able to then port that information to a landlord attorney and proceed with the eviction process.
It's almost like artificial intelligence, AI, to a degree, of who meets this criteria for eviction, and then they work kind of hand in hand with legal representatives. You highlight this powerful law firm, Willis Law, and their bundling of these eviction cases for the courts in Columbus in particular. What did that look like? This law firm that seemingly has made a bit of a specialty in representing these landlords in eviction cases in Ohio.
Yeah, so the issue with eviction court, depending on where you are, is whether or not you need a representative in court to proceed with an eviction. And you used to not have to have that in Columbus. There was a practice known as sort of eviction by affidavit, where this law firm would take affidavits from the property manager and proceed forward with the evictions. And it can be time consuming. Like for a landlord to deal with an eviction, to have to go to court is time consuming. Now, there was a legal fight where that practice was outlawed, but it didn't do much to stop this sort of batching of evictions on the docket. So the sort of brilliance of their business model, Willis Law, is they're able to go to their clients and say, we're very efficient. You don't have to give up the labor time of sending your property manager to be there all day or to go on multiple days. They're able to go, say, on one day and deal with, 20, 30 evictions at one time, which I witnessed quite frequently. I spent a lot of time there, and, certain cases would be called up for a very specific property, and they would just be taken care of very, very quickly. So, and out of the dockets, which often ran over 100 a day, Willis would dominate that. They would have the vast majority of those cases on an ongoing basis. And although I never was able to figure out how much they were making on each of those evictions, it's plainly a very, very profitable practice to batch and evict quite frequently for landlords at that level of efficiency.
And Columbus in particular was a hotbed of evictions. I hadn't realized how frequent evictions were in Columbus until obviously I read your piece.
Yeah.
But so I guess if you could just speak to how frequent they've become and what the pandemic looked like within that context.
Yeah, I mean, I think what's fascinating is the city has really taken up the issue of evictions since about 2016. When Evicted by Matthew Desmond was published, it was read quite widely among the city's elite, and there was a commission that was formed by the mayor. He appointed his wife to head it up, and there was a concerted effort to recognize the city had a problem. Columbus has had tremendous growth compared to other cities in Ohio, and we've had just skyrocketing rents. I live here, so it's something I've experienced and witnessed. And you would think that might have put a dent in the filings. And what's a little disturbing and concerning, quite frankly, for a Midwest city that had, for decades been quite affordable, is despite valiant efforts by the city, by the legal aid community, is seeing more evictions than they ever had. And also during this time frame, during the pandemic, during a phase when about $130 million in rental assistance was funneled, through this court, and essentially, it depending on your advantage or how you think about such things, like enriching landlords through that process, during a time of, economic upheaval, when, the risk of having properties during, times of crises, things went on as normal, and they had some of their best years ever during the pandemic. Rents were at their highest rate. Occupancy rates were really high. Yet the thing that I found from just spending time and embedding myself at eviction court is the evictions kept happening. There was sort of this I think, a sense that the moratoriums stopped evictions, but they didn't. I mean, thousands of people were still evicted, and you know, despite 100 and, in this, small area on the national level, it was about $46 billion, but they really did not stop for any length of time.
So the millions poured into the landlords, and they seemed quite content. But evictions, even though there was a moratorium, that didn't curb, or did it curb slightly during some period of time? Either way, though, the tenants didn't, outside of the payments that came from the federal government, the one under Trump, and then when right after Biden got elected, there really was no. It was very asymmetrical what tenants received in terms of protections versus the millions that were flowing into the coffers of landlords.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that was most on a very detailed level is this money was flowing in, the crisis was unfolding, yet the late fees and the court fees were still tacked on to each of these cases. And so there was really no give in the system. The landlords were being made whole, and the tenants, in some cases, I mean, to be accurate, I did see, and this was unusual during, the big infusions of that money, some tenants did get, $8,000 in rent arrears paid off, and they were saved from evictions. But often there was, $1,000 in late fees tacked onto that the landlord was able to, profit from, because in a lot of cases, these were very egregious late fees within the local context that I saw. So yeah, I mean, I think the issue that I found so fascinating working on this is there really was just a really big disconnect between landlords are going to be made whole, but there were going to be no conditions on how they treated tenants throughout this process, and very little restrictions on no restrictions on rent increases or late fees.
We're in a bubbling national discourse about squatters' rights right now, right? And the notion that this is in some way a real hindrance to landlords and their ability to do what they want to do with their tenants. And but as your piece really lays bare, there are a lot of protections in place for landlords legally, and very little protections in place for people who may not be able to afford their rent for a little while. I mean, what were some of the cases that you saw where people were pushed out of their homes because of circumstances maybe that they even couldn't control?
Well, I mean, certainly in the context of rent increases, that's out of the control of tenants. And, in sort of an economic environment, particularly in Columbus, where you're not seeing significant wage increases, people end up just in a vicious cycle of not being able to, afford where they're living. And I mean, rent increases anywhere from, I've seen 30% rent increases for tenants. When I spoke and communicated with them about their struggles. And so there's really no way for someone who's working a low wage job to keep up with that level of rent increase.
Right. And so when, say, your rent gets increased 30%, you don't have anywhere to go, and you are evicted, but you're staying longer as you figure out your next move. That would be an example of why squatters' rights would be important, or tenants' rights versus the right of a landlord to evict whenever they choose.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge of the moment is landlord-tenant law is a very local matter. It varies state by state. It can even vary city by city, and so a lot of the push on that I saw in talking to a lot of tenants' rights groups and national groups that are studying this problem is that there's really no way out of this bind unless there's some federal regulation on what's going on for the, within landlord tenant law.
Right.
That's a challenging, complicated, uh, uh, yeah, I mean, how that unfolds. I mean, there's been some various attempts. There's been some really interesting proposals, but I think we're very early days on how to sort of address this gap between sort of the legal context at the local level and the limits of federal intervention into the housing crisis that, I saw, if it's even happening in Columbus, Ohio, where, pretty much rents were mostly affordable in my, in my lifetime, and have just in the last 10 years become just punitive to the point of impossible for most people. The question of kind of how to solve that is, I think, remains, an open question.
Certainly. I mean, we're getting a little bit of a trickle out from the Biden administration that they see housing as a problem. I'd said a few months ago Biden should run on a national housing initiative, but we haven't federally funded affordable housing since the 90s because of the Faircloth Amendment and like these neoliberal practices. We should have some sort of standardized national rent control in addition to building more housing and zoning practices so there can be duplexes and really though I just can't imagine how in any just society a 30% rental increase should be allowed. I mean, that should be federally regulated as an undue burden on the tenant, but we don't have tenants protections nationally in this country whatsoever.
Yeah, I mean, the push for a tenant bill of rights was kind of, was the blueprint in January of 2023. Yeah, so we're a year later now. What that's sort of been diluted down to is a possible cap of 10% on rent increases for housing that's that receives low-income housing tax credits in the U.S. So that's an interesting proposal, but it would only impact about 2.5 million households. And when you think about there's 44 million rental households, is that enough? And additionally, the people I interviewed at Eviction Court, the people I spend time with in other reporting that I'm doing, a 10% increase is still impossible economically for most people.
Right.
I mean, 30% is out there, but even capping at 10% is, I mean, inflation rates of 4 and 5% put people under. At 10% for one of your biggest monthly expenses is impossible for a lot of people, and can lead to them being displaced and without housing. So,
and as we wrap up here, Mya, what in your observations, what was the kind of or what were the kind of people who were landlords, right? And who were the kind of people who were tenants? Are you seeing this kind of rapid increase in corporately owned housing in Columbus? I mean, you speak about this automated landlord system, but for the kind of more existing structure in Columbus, who are the landlords, and then who are the tenants, really?
Columbus has seen a mass infusion of investment from out of state and a lot of consolidation into. It's not just that you have landlords who are, Wall Street owners, but you have property management systems that operate for smaller landlords. So even this idea of a mom and pop landlord, maybe someone who in the past had 10 to 12 properties that they managed personally, they're now turning that over to these property management, either companies or software programs that really takes a lot of the human discretion out of that relationship. So you're seeing that I think on a pretty rapid, it's almost a complete change in how that relationship works. And so I've seen that here, where it just, people have kind of given up and just turned over the management of that to other companies. So that's a significant change in how tenants sort of interacted with their landlords. I would say for tenants, I think the frustrating thing that I've seen from them is they just can't negotiate with anybody. It's very difficult to begin a conversation about, I'm having an issue, I had my car break down, I can't make my rent this month, and just a little lack of accommodation or grace within the system because of the way that these metrics that are now being applied through property management software to making decisions about ensuring the landlord's not just profitability, but perhaps excessive profitability in their portfolios. So that's a
Yes.
vast change. Yeah.
My building in COVID, and I moved into this building. I'm in here in Brooklyn, probably around 6 months after one of these corporate conglomerates purchased it. And the tenants that were there before speak of an entirely different situation until after this management company purchased it. And I will say that the only way I got my air conditioning repaired last summer, in the middle of the summer, in August, after it breaking down for 2 months, was I had to file a complaint with the city, and they came and inspected it and issued a violation, and that was the only way that it got fixed. So it had also leaked into the floorboards and warped, and mold was starting. So it was a total nightmare. And it's one of the, I mean, this is universal, I gotta say. Like, this is exactly something I had experienced too. And at least the unit is rent controlled. That's part of why they are so hesitant to improve it, because they can't gouge people. But you're even showing that in places where there's no rent control and they go up 30%, there are still those conditions that are created because there's this kind of impunity right now for landlords, especially when they're big corporations and it becomes so standardized.
Certainly. Yeah. I mean, I think that even adding to that, there's a lot of informal displacement of tenants, especially within low-income housing that is available. In Columbus, we had 2 mass displacements of people within a 2-year period. You're talking not a few, 30, 40 people, like hundreds of families in a single day displaced. So there's nowhere for them to go.
Right.
It's just getting harder for people to find a viable situation to just live their daily lives. So yeah.
Well, I appreciate your time today, and the piece is really good in Harper's. It's called The Evictions Experts, and we will link to it wherever you're listening to or watching this. Mya Frazier, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you.